There was no telescreen, but there must be hidden microphones. Besides, they could be seen. It did not matter. Nothing mattered. They could have lain down on the ground and done that if they had wanted to. His flesh froze with horror at the thought of it. She made no response whatsoever to the clasp of his arm. She did not even try to disengage herself. He knew now what had changed in her. Her face was smaller, and there was a long scar, partially hidden by the hair, across her forehead and temple. But that was not the change. It was that her waist had grown thicker, and in a surprising way had stiffened. He remembered how once, after the explosion of a rocket bomb, he had helped to drag a corpse out of some ruins, and that had been astonished not only by the incredible weight of the thing, but its rigidity and awkwardness to handle, which made it seem more like stone than flesh. Her body felt like that. It occurred to him that the texture of her skin would be quite different from what it had once been. They did not attempt to kiss her, nor did they speak. As they walked back across the grass, she looked directly at him for the first time. It was only a momentary glance, full of contempt and dislike. He wondered whether it was dislike that came purely out of the past, or whether it was inspired also by his bloated face and the water that the wind kept squeezing from his eyes. They sat down on 2 iron chairs, side by side, but not too close together. He saw that she was about to speak. She moved her clumsy shoe a few centimeters and deliberately crushed a twig. Her feet seemed to have grown broader, he noticed. "I betrayed you," she said badly. "I betrayed you," he said. She gave him another look of dislike. "Sometimes," she said, "they threaten you with something you can't stand up to, even think about. And then you say, 'Don't do it to me, do it to someone else, do it to so-and-so.' And perhaps you might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick, and that you said it to make them stop, and didn't really mean it. But that isn't true. At the time when it happens, you do mean it. You think there's no other way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself." "All you care about is yourself," he echoed. "And after that, you don't feel the same towards the other person any longer." "No," he said. "You don't feel the same." There did not seem to be anything more to say. The wind plastered their thin overalls against their bodies. Almost at once it became embarrassing to sit there in silence. Besides, it was too cold to keep still. She said something about catching her tube, and stood up to go. "We must meet again," he said. "Yes," she said. "We must meet again." He followed irresolutely for a little distance, half a pace behind her. They did not speak again. She did not actually try to shake him off, but walked at just such a speed as to prevent him keeping abreast of her. He had made up his mind that he would accompany her as far as the tube station, but suddenly this process of trailing along in the cold seemed pointless and unbearable. He was overwhelmed by a desire not so much to get away from Julia as to get back to the Chestnut Tree Cafe, which had never seemed so attractive at this moment. He had a nostalgic vision of his corner table with the newspaper and the chessboard and the overflowing gin. Above all, it would be warm in there. The next moment, not altogether by accident, he allowed himself to become separated from her by a small knot of people. He made a half-hearted attempt to catch up, then slowed down, turned, and made off in the opposite direction. When he had gone 50 meters, he looked back. The street was not crowded, but already he could not distinguish her. Any one of the dozen hurrying figures might have been hers. Perhaps her thickened, stiffened body was no longer recognizable from behind. "At the time when it happens," she had said, "you do mean it." He had meant it. He had not merely said it. He had wished it. He had wished that she, and not he, should be delivered over to the... Something changed in the music that trickled from the telescreen and cracked, and a jeering note, a yellow note, came into it. And then, Perhaps it was not happening. Perhaps it was only a memory taking over the semblance of sound. A voice was singing. Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you, and you sold me. The tears welled up in his eyes. A passing waiter noticed that his glass was empty and came back with a gin bottle. He took up his glass and sniffed at it. The stuff grew not less but more horrible with every mouthful he drank. But it had become the element he swam in. It was his life, his death, and his resurrection. It was gin that sank him into the stupor every night, and gin that revived him every morning. When he woke, seldom before 1100, with gummed-up eyelids and a fiery mouth, and a back that seemed to be broken, it would have been impossible even to rise from the horizontal, if it had not been for the bottle and teacup placed beside the bed overnight. Through the midday hours he sat with glazed face, the bottle handy, listening to the telescreen. From 15 to closing time he was a fixture in the chestnut tree. No one cared what he did any longer. No whistle woke him. No telescreen admonished him. Occasionally, perhaps twice a week, he went to a dusty, forgotten-looking office in the Ministry of Truth and did a little work, or what was called work. He had been appointed to a subcommittee of a subcommittee, which had sprouted from one of the innumerable committees dealing with minor difficulties that arose in the compilation of the 11th edition of Newspeak Dictionary. They were engaged in producing something called an interim report, but what it was they were reporting on he had never definitely found out. It was something to do with questions of whether commas should be placed inside brackets or outside. There were 4 others on the committee, all of them persons similar to himself. There were days when they assembled, and then promptly dispersed again, frankly admitting to one another that there was not really anything to be done. But there were other days when they settled down to their work almost eagerly, making a tremendous show of entering up their minutes and drafting long memorandums which were never finished, when the arguments as to what they were supposed to be arguing about grew extraordinarily involved and abstruse, with subtle hanging over definitions, enormous discretions, quarrels, threats, even to appeal to a higher authority. And then suddenly the life would go out of them, and they would sit round the table looking at one another with extinct eyes, like ghosts fading at cock-crow. The telescreen was silent for a moment. Winston raised his head again. The bulletin. But no, they were merely changing the music. He had the map of Africa behind his eyelids. The movement of the armies was a diagram, a black arrow tearing vertically southward, and a white arrow horizontally eastward across the tail of the first. As though for reassurance he looked up to the imperturbable face in the portrait. Was it conceivable that the second arrow did not even exist? His interest flagged again. He drank another mouthful of the gin, picked up the White Knight, and made a tentative move. Check. But it was evidently not the right move, because, uncalled, a memory floated into his mind. He saw a candle-lit room with a vast white counterpane bed, and himself, a boy of 9 or 10, sitting on the floor, shaking a dice box and laughing excitedly. His mother was sitting opposite him, and also laughing.